We've been talking about what to do for the Christmas ornament this year. I started pulling out scrap pieces from old projects and started to think about maybe putting them together into something that I could wood turn into a Christmas ornament. And I started by thinking I would glue pieces together and kind of fit everything perfectly and precisely into a blob that I could wood turn. But then I thought maybe if I just cast the pieces in resin, this would be a lot easier. I had a second container made for the dustbin sawdust experiment sphere. So I pulled the sawdust out of that and I started to stack pieces of old projects into that container. Now with a lot of projects, I tend to make either extra pieces or I've cut off some part of the project and I have remnants of different projects that allude to the project that they came from. So I started to stack those pieces in my cylindrical container. As I was doing this, I thought maybe because I was going to be making a sphere in the end, I would make sort of a waste piece of wood that would fit in the cylinder that would take up some of the volume of the resin and would be easier to turn away than turning the resin on the lathe. So I cut out a hemisphere on the CNC machine. I didn't really have to do the finishing pass, but I wanted to see what it would look like. So what this would be is a ring that would fit inside the cylinder and just take up some of the space of the resin. After I got it all cut out and I was fitting it in the cylinder and seeing it with the other pieces, the way that I wanted the sphere to work is that the pieces I was putting in the cylinder to make the sphere, I would want to have them sectioned at the surface of the sphere, if that makes sense. Like, I wouldn't want the pieces to be completely buried in the resin. This piece I'm making would stop that from happening. And it was also just taking up a lot of space in the cylinder. So I ended up not using this. And I just put the project pieces in the cylinder. I strengthened up the bottom of the cylinder a little bit with hot glue. Although this didn't make a whole lot of sense as I ended up putting this in the oven overnight and trying to dry the wood out as much as possible. And I tried to make the top of the cylinder a little more round with a band clamp, but it really didn't make it any more round. But it did help hold it together, so it wasn't a bad thing in the end. And I mixed up resin. I made a batch of 800 grams to start, which I was hoping would be enough. It was hard to know how much resin I was really going to need, as I had all of these little random pieces to fill around. And the 800 grams ended up being not nearly enough. So I had to quickly make a second batch of 700 grams. And that ended up being just about exactly right, which was luck. And once I had that in the form, I could put it in the pressure pot. I need to make a little basket or something with a handle on it to lower the pieces into the pressure pot. Then I can put the lid on. I can add the pressure. I've got it set at a little less than 70, which is probably a little bit high. And I let that sit pretty much all day, so probably about 10 hours, which is probably more than it needs. And I let the air out. So it looked like it came out okay. I wanted to cut the plate I had on the bottom off so it would just be a cylinder. And I sanded the bottom a little bit. I sanded the top too, so it would sit flat. I wanted to attach a block of wood to the flat end. And I wanted that to be as centered as I could make it, as that'll be what the chuck on the lathe will hold on to. So I can turn the piece without having the chuck be in the way. I let that dry overnight and let the resin continue to harden overnight. Then I can put the whole thing on the lathe and hope for the best. I wanted to make a small hole for the tailstock to hold on to. So I drilled a very shallow, small hole that the tailstock could fit into. And that would help the tailstock hold that end a little better. I wanted to find the center of the sphere. So it's not really the center of this that I have at the moment. It's more the center of the sphere that's inside of this. That's what that line is on the cylinder. Now I can make it a little more round and start to turn off the corners and start to get towards a sphere. So it's a little bit choppy at the beginning, but then it gets better. Turning the resin is a little different than turning the wood, as you can't be quite as aggressive. So it's somewhat slow going, although it wasn't too bad turning these corners off. And you can see that block of wood allows the piece to be away from the chuck a little bit. So I can get into that end to shape the sphere. So at this point, I'm just going by eye, trying to make something round. I was starting to see also that the casting of the resin wasn't the best, as there were a few bubbles and a few cracks. So once it's getting pretty close to a sphere, you can hold a round object up to the piece and sort of get the distance between your eye, the object, and the piece right, and you can see how close you are to a circle. And once it's fairly close, it doesn't have to be perfect, but as long as it's pretty close, you can start the sphere building process. So I cut off the ends at this point, as I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees on the lathe. I don't need the chuck anymore. I have some wooden cups that I've made for different size spheres. And I find with the drive side wooden cup, I have to freshen it up every time I use it, as it's wood and it changes shape over time. So I can put the piece back on the lathe, rotated 90 degrees from the way it was before. And this first rotation takes a little bit of moving the piece around, trying to get it centered. And it still looks like it isn't really all that centered at this point. At this point, you continue to find the sphere within the piece, and you turn to that circle. And each time you rotate the piece and go through the turning process, it gets closer and closer to a sphere. And you take less and less off with each pass. With the resin, I've found holding the bowl gouge almost horizontally and using it more like a scraper almost works really well. I'm going to plug the Maker's Mob again. I'm excited to announce that the Samurai Carpenter is going to be hosting the first ever live Maker's Mob 8-week woodworking challenge. In this event, he will be showing his favorite joinery techniques. And at the end, he will be showing the techniques in a finished project, which will be a doorway entry shelf. Because it's a live event, registration ends on December 27th, so that everyone can start at the same time. I will put a link in the description of the video if you're interested. Please check it out. You can see here each pass I'd sort of do the side, and then I could do the middle with a slightly different hand movement, and do the other side the same way, and do the middle. And I would basically do this and then rotate the piece 90 degrees and do that again, and rotate the piece 90 degrees and do that again. And each time you do that, you can feel that it's getting closer and closer to a sphere. You can see it getting slightly smaller here over time. Also, it really helps to use your hips and legs to actually do the movement, and use your hands just as a guide. It's counterintuitive, but that gives you much more control over the tool, and it allows you to do the very subtle turning that you need to do with this resin. If you come in too fast, you'll chip the resin with the tool. So it's incredibly light passes. It's kind of a Zen dance for hours on end. The turning is about done at this point. And I can start to sand. Sanding spheres goes pretty quickly because there's no inside of a bowl or a vessel to sand, so it's all outside, which makes it fairly easy. And they're usually not real big. So I started with 80 grit, I think, and I got up to 2,000. Now the resin had a few bubbles and some cracks, so I had to blow the sawdust out of that. Now I've got some Yorkshire grit I can use to do the final polishing and put a finish on it. And I'm still doing the same thing where I'll do one side and then rotate it 90 degrees and then do another side and rotate and polish and rotate and polish. And I blew the grit out of the cracks and bubbles. So I don't know if I poured this in too big of a batch, or it's because my resin is a little bit old. The resin isn't the best I think that it could be. And this project, I really like the idea, but the way that it looks in the end, I don't know that it's my favorite piece. There are parts of it that I really like, and then there are other parts not so much. It's kind of like it's a big ball of accidents, and some of them are happy and some of them aren't.
1, 2, 3. Merry Christmas.
Thanks for watching.